From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network, and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. Called one of the axis of evil nations, a nuclear threat and an implacable foe of the U.S., we go inside Iran today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Misagh Parsa is a professor of sociology at Dartmouth, where I was lucky enough to attend and get my MBA. It's a special place up there. And Misagh specializes in Middle Eastern and Asian studies. He's got a book out called Democracy in Iran, Why It Failed and How It Might Succeed. I want to welcome the professor, and I want to thank Dartmouth Broadcasting, Heath Cole, for setting this up where they're coming from. So welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me.
By the way, are you from Iran?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Let me start off with democracy and Iran. That seems kind of like an oxymoron, trying to put them together. We get this impression of the U.S. that it's a monolithic, kind of theocratic culture. Talk a little bit about that first.
Well, the Iranian Revolution that took place in 1979 actually meant to produce democracy and freedom in Iran, and unfortunately ended up producing a political system that became theocratic. And Ayatollah Khomeini, throughout the revolutionary struggles, promised that the new system, the Islamic system, will provide freedom to everybody, even including Marxists and communists would be free as long as they weren't engaged in conspiracy against the system. They would have political freedom. So everybody was promised political freedom, and everybody expected to have political freedom and democracy. But unfortunately, it ended up to become a theocratic state that denied political freedom to the vast majority of the population, except those who had the power.
All right, we're going to get into more detail on that, too, in the next segment. First, I want to start off with some more recent information for folks. The Iran nuke deal was just recertified by the U.S., which was somewhat of a surprise because Trump had run against sort of tearing it up. I want to get your comments on that. Have they been adhering to the spirit of the law? Was this a good decision?
Yes, pretty much that's what has been going on. The sanctions were very severe on the Islamic Republic, and they finally decided that they had to agree with the international community, the 5+1. And apparently all the reports show that they have not violated any of the principles that they agreed to.
At the current time, are you comfortable saying that there are moderates with some degree of power in Iran or not?
Yes, there are a lot of moderates, but the problem is that the power rests not with the moderates, but with the supreme leader and the unelected organizations that are under his control, the Guardian Council, Assembly Experts, and Expediency Council. These are not controlled by the moderates. So the moderates that get elected either to the parliament, the Majlis, or to the presidency have actually very little power. And the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, can veto anything they decide. So on everything, basically, he has the ultimate say, and the moderates do not really contribute much to the final decision-making.
Do they have a goal of a Shiite caliphate, sort of stretching from Lebanon to Syria? Is that a real goal of theirs, and to destabilize the Middle East?
Well, they have been talking from the very beginning of the revolution to export the revolution to the rest of the region. But sometimes the claim is that Ayatollah Khomeini, who is the supreme leader, he's actually the leader of the entire Islamic world. So the Shiites, constituting the majority of the population in Iraq, they had a chance to export the revolution, and Ayatollah Khomeini, at the beginning of the revolution, encouraged the Iraqis, the Shiites, and so forth. They had been working with them before the revolution even, and after the revolution, they intensified their work to promote the causes of the Shiite population in Iraq. And so that ultimately resulted in the Iran-Iraq War, 8 years of war, that was devastating for both countries. And also it threatened the Ayatollahs encouraging rebellion in other parts of the Middle East, threatened Saudi Arabia and other powerful countries in the region that ended up siding with Saddam Hussein to prevent the Islamic Republic's expansion. So there's also the Shiite population in Lebanon that they have organized the Hezbollah and all that. But to take over the entire Middle East, I would say that's a little bit of a stretch.
Getting back to the Iran nuclear deal for a second, whether they've adhered to it, I know I'd read that they've supposedly produce more uranium and heavy water that they're allowed. They've tested some nuclear-capable missiles, as we know. They've threatened to attack U.S. ships. Do you think, are they adhering to the law, first off, and are they adhering to the spirit of the law?
Well, there's a little bit disagreement on this issue, but I don't think attacking the United States, and there are claims occasionally that a couple of days ago, the commander of the chief of the armed forces said that the United States should move their bases about 1,000 kilometers away from Iran, and so threatening to attack. But Iran is no match for the United States or even for Israel. These are just claims they make to pretend that they're very powerful. In fact, the more important issue has to do not with their foreign policy, but with Iran's domestic policy and basis of support. The Iranian government, the Islamic regime, has lost the support of much of the population, and the real issue is here. They constantly try to instigate external conflicts in order to promote national support, promote social cohesion and national support to stay in power. That's exactly what happened with the hostage crisis. That's exactly what happened with the 8-year war with Iraq. The real issues lie there, not with real conflicts with the United States or Israel.
That's interesting, and it's somewhat similar to what Putin has done in Russia, too, which is, look for external conflict to try to unite internally. Does Iran still have a goal to eradicate Israel?
Well, they keep stating it, but during the war with Iraq, they bought arms, and later on some of the leaders of the Islamic Republic were dealing with Israel, and so there are allegations that those things happen. But they talk about death to Israel. But here the interesting issue is that if you're interested, when we talk about the Green Movement, and they keep talking about it during the Green Movement, but people really don't take it seriously.
We're going to talk about the Green Movement in more depth so people know exactly what that is. I want to ask another recent one, though, that they recently sentenced this Princeton student who was doing research on his doctorate to 10 years in jail, charging espionage. That's a pretty bad thing, isn't it?
Yes, the student is in trouble, and part of the problem is that when they get arrested, sometimes they get tortured. And I don't know what they're going to do with the student here, the Chinese American, but in the past when they arrest students or visitors, they end up torturing them, and then they will, under pressure, sometimes extreme torture, they end up admitting that they spied or they are spies, they're on a mission, whatever you want to say, and then they sign a statement and sign it, and admitting that they have done while they hadn't done anything. And so this is a very unfortunate situation. Last night, President Trump, the White House, stated that Iran should release all Americans held in jail. There are a few of them, not a lot. But this has been a regular practice that they have been doing, using the visitors or students or scientists that go there for visits or conferences, things like that. They end up in jail, and they are used as bargaining chip against the United States or other countries. And now the White House statement last night is very ominous. So
let me ask you in our last minute of this segment, what's your own Iran story? Why'd you leave?
Oh, I left in 1970. I was a student. My family was poor and didn't really much of a future, and I served in the army, and I decided finally that I need to go abroad and to get a college education. I didn't have any money, so somebody suggested if you don't have money, Europe is not a place for you. Just go to the United States. And he suggested you can go to college and work. And that's exactly what I did. I came to the United States in 1970, and I ended up not being able to go back.
Very interesting. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, listen over the Internet, access our archive of podcasts, and we'll talk with Misagh about why democracy failed in Iran next. And we're back with our guest, Dartmouth professor, Iran expert, Misagh Parsa. And we're going to explore why democracy failed. And it's a fascinating topic because most Americans don't even know that was on the table when the 1979 Iran Revolution happened. We view it almost as the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency because of the hostage crisis and the Ayatollah's impact. So go back a little bit and give us some history on this and what was promised versus what was ended up.
So the 1970s, Iran's oil revenues increased as a result of the OPEC oil embargo in 1973. So Iran's revenues quadrupled basically about a year or two after that. And so a lot of money, petrodollars, came into the country, produced inflation, but also high levels of inequality. Those who had access to the big banks and government financial institutions could borrow the money and then invest and make a lot of profit. But a huge portion of the middle class and working class were not served. To deal with the problem of inflation, the Shah of Iran imposed an anti-profiteering campaign and ended up arresting a bunch of merchants and putting them to jail. And these merchants had been supporters of Dr. Mossadegh in 1953, and they wanted to have greater freedom. So once this anti-profiteering campaign started against merchants, we call them bazaris in Iran, and they started becoming politically more antagonized against the regime. And then finally, President Carter was elected, and he pressed for human rights and advocated human rights in some of the countries that were repressive, had authoritarian regimes. So the Shah of Iran reduced political repression, and to some extent in response to President Carter's advocacy of human rights, and that prompted the opposition to demand political freedom and civil liberties. So that gradually brought in the moderate opposition, the liberals who were supporters of Dr. Mossadegh, and then gradually leftists and socialists and students who were largely socialists in major universities, they joined in, and the bazaris joined in after that. And that sort of challenged the Shah's regime basically. None of these things happened for quite a while. And in the summer of 1978, the Shah decided to respond to some of the demands of the opposition and introduce greater reforms. Once those reforms were introduced and greater political freedom was granted, the working class and the middle classes started joining the opposition, and that nationalized the protests against the Shah's regime. And so by the time you get to the December of 1978, the vast majority of the population in Iran are against the monarchy and calling for independence, freedom, and Islamic Republic. So throughout this period, Ayatollah Khomeini made a large number of statements from Iraq and then from France, from Paris, and that promised political freedom. Day after day, political freedom, there's no democracy, and the clergy should work with students and intellectuals, it's the intellectuals, and these are the people who will become lawyers and government ministers and presidents, prime ministers, and you work with them, and his own place, he said, was in the mosque, and he would have nothing to do with politics. And so all the promises were very good, and he received the support of the vast majority of the population. Once he returned, the provisional revolutionary government that was in office was primarily composed of liberals. And so they ended up writing a constitution that was very liberal and like sort of European model of the constitution they had adopted way back in 1906. And so it was supposed to be everything democratic, but suddenly the hostages were taken, and then they changed the provisional government led by Prime Minister Bazargan. They resigned, and then a theocratic constitution was written up, and under the threat of conflicts with the United States and American attacks and so forth, and repression of dissent and dissidents, he managed to get the population to vote in favor of the Constitution. And as the process continued, class conflict also intensified. So the poor, the working class, everybody was mobilizing. Khomeini suddenly shifted from actually a little bit earlier than the Constitution, that the Islamic Republic was to serve the interests of the downtrodden. They called it the Mustazifin. And that he gained the support of the left. This was a situation, I meant support of the working class, and he marginalized the left. I apologize for the confusion. Marginalized the left, gained the support of portions of the working class, and throughout the next period, he also used intense repression. Shut down newspapers, you name it, arresting dissidents, putting them against the wall and shooting them. And so between June of 1981 to September 1985, Ayatollah Khomeini executed or killed during armed struggle about 12,000 people. Many of these, about 4,000 of them were students, college university students, and closed down the universities for at least 2 years and executed a large number of people in Kurdistan, in the Turkmen region, and basically ended up demobilizing the opposition during that period. And after that, basically, the opposition couldn't really challenge Ayatollah Khomeini. Then came summer of 1988, the Ayatollah executed, the war ended, and as soon as the war ended, he ordered the execution of something like at least 5,000 people who were in prison. Some of these people had finished serving their terms and were about to release, had not been released, and some of them were about to be released. So these people were executed, and then the opposition lost basically having any claim because everybody was silenced. By that time, everything ended. For the next 10 years, there was no conflict going on, no little protests here and there, but nothing, until came the protest of the students in 1999.
It's almost, to me, I kept thinking of Castro in Cuba doing the same kind of bait and switch, coming in as a Democrat. Batista's corrupt regime would be out, and then sort of switching everything to, in Iran, you get death for homosexuality, women treated as a second class as well. We have about a minute to go. Let's finish up on this failure of democracy with a little bit on the Green Movement, and then we'll talk more in the next segment.
Well, the Green Movement happens 10 years after the student movement, and this happens in 2009. The student movement came in 1999. 10 years later, the Green Movement came, and the movement was in response to the disputed 10th presidential election. Ahmadinejad claimed that he won, and before the voting ended, Ahmadinejad was claiming he won, and then Mir Hossein Mousavi, who was the opposition candidate, former prime minister, 8 years of prime minister during the war, and he was claiming he won, and that instigated the Green Movement.
Coming next, we'll look at how might democracy succeed in Iran and more on what we were discussing on why it failed. We're back with Misagh Parsa. He's the author of Democracy in Iran, Why It Failed and How It Might Succeed. And where I wanted to start here is because I found this very interesting, this framework that you've devised about how an autocratic regime to get to a path to democracy can go reform or revolution. And you cite South Korea is succeeding in that, and the Philippines and Suharto in Indonesia failing in that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But just to give people a perspective, I guess when the initial revolution came in '79, the standard of living in Iran and South Korea was about equal. This is 1980. And by 2009, when this green movement started, the standard of living in Iran was one-third the level of South Korea. So talk about your reform or revolution sort of paradigm.
Excuse me. When I started writing this book, I realized that neither political sociologists nor political scientists had developed a theoretical model, a perspective that would tell us about under what conditions authoritarian regimes could become democratic through political reform, under what conditions authoritarian regimes had to go through revolutionary struggles to become democratic. And so there was no model, and so I divided the countries that I was studying: South Korea, Indonesia, Iran, the Philippines. I have also studied Nicaragua and Egypt to some extent, and developed about 10 variables that examine under what conditions a country can become democratic through reform, under what condition there has to be a revolution. So South Korea was a country that economically became very successful, although were similar in 1979, 1980, similar level of development. South Korea actually industrialized very rapidly and developed economically, and by 1987, South Korea was actually a democratic country, although the military won the elections a few years after that, but finally the military was pushed aside, and through reform, and there wasn't a violent overthrow of the government. In Indonesia, that did not happen. Indonesian economic development was not as successful as South Korea. They were still dependent on oil. Income inequality was very extensive, much more than South Korea. And in 1988, with the help of students and the poor, 1998, the government of Indonesia, the President Suharto, was finally overthrown after 35 years of power, staying in power. The question was that what way Iran could go. And given the fact that Iran's economic development has been very, very unsuccessful, a very failed example of economic development in the Middle East and in actually the whole world. Iran's per capita GDP in 1976 peaked to about $13,300. That's $2,005. By 2009, Iran's per capita GDP had declined to about $9,400. So that's 30 years of decline for these people. So economically they lost. Income inequalities, the Gini coefficient shows that by that time the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, declined a little bit, but the Gini coefficient really doesn't show the real face of inequality in Iran. What happened after the revolution, once the clerics seized power, they were able to seize the assets, the economic resources of the monarchy, the monarch's family, the royal family, the entire upper echelon of the capitalist class, many of whom fled the country. Some were executed. Many of them fled the country. The clergy seized all of them and put into foundations to support the poor, the mustazifin. But everybody in Iran is now poorer. The clergy is the wealthy category, along with the Revolutionary Guard. So the Gini coefficient doesn't show that inequality increased because that portion of the wealth that was owned by the wealthy people, the royal family and the rest of their associates, more than 1,000 families, were all expropriated and do not go into the equation when they measure income inequality. So that's the crux of the matter, and it shows that slightly more equal distribution of income, but also doesn't show inequality in wealth. And in the early 1990s, there was a survey in Iran that showed 77% of the Iranians claimed intense anger about the distribution of wealth and income. So based on that comparison, for South Korea and Indonesia, just on the distribution of wealth and income and success or failure of economic development, I'm arguing that Iran's economic development resembles more like Indonesia rather than South Korea. And failed economic development reduces support for the government, reduces support for reform, because people have lost everything. Reform is not going to solve their problems. The whole system has to change fundamentally. And that fundamental change in part revealed itself in the demands of the protesters during the Green Movement.
And why didn't the Green Movement ultimately succeed?
Excellent question. It's very complicated. The problem with the Green Movement was that, the first problem was that the leaders of the Green Movement, former Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi, who claimed he had won the elections, and his associates and colleagues, they wanted to work through the system. These were people that didn't want to overthrow the system. At the beginning of the protests, he called the Islamic Republic as a sacred system, and he said a number of times that we are not in favor of calling for the overthrow of the regime and so forth. So the problem was that the vast majority of those who were involved in the Green Movement, a week after the movement started, they were calling for death to dictator. They were calling for independence, freedom, and Iranian Republic as opposed to Islamic Republic, and they were calling a lot of radical slogans. They were shouting very radical slogans, and one day, I remember it was the Quds, the Jerusalem day, that loudspeakers were shouting slogans, and people were supposed to follow them. So the loudspeaker says, "Death to America." And the protesters, who were Green Movement, participated in that day in favor of Jerusalem. They weren't shouting death to America. They said, "Death to Russia." Then the loudspeaker says, "Death to Israel." So they're supposed to be saying death to Israel, and this is the Jerusalem, the Quds Day, and they were saying death to China, because they view Russia and China as close allies of the Islamic Republic, and they didn't have problems with the United States or Israel. And so I kept listening to all these YouTube reports. One after another, they kept coming, and there was almost nothing that you could hear after the loudspeaker said. There's no voice that says death to America or death to Israel. This was very shocking. So the extent of division between the people and the regime is just amazing, shocking. They have moved so far away from each other. And so the first problem was that the leaders of the movement didn't want to go far. The movement participants in the streets wanted to go much farther and being done with the Islamic Republic. So that was the first problem, that they did not succeed. The second problem was the fact that the opposition didn't really prepare themselves for the repression that was coming. And the repression in the Islamic Republic has been very skillful, as arresting people. Thousands of people were arrested immediately as the Green Movement started. And they weren't prepared to hide them or protect them, their members and their supporters and so forth. But the bigger problem had to do with the fact that to overthrow a regime or a government, you need to have a very broad coalition.
Yeah.
That's why Ayatollah Khomeini kept making all the promises prior to the revolution, making sure that every segment of the population would side with him and would participate in the revolutionary struggles to overthrow the Shah. That broad coalition did not emerge in the 2009 Green Movement. The opposition failed to bring in the merchant class that had played an important role in the revolutionary struggles, but also the working classes. The individual merchants and individual workers participated in the revolutionary struggles, but they did not participate as classes and collectivities. And that's why, in part, they were repressed. And the final reason that they failed was the fact that this movement was very large. It began like 3 million people on June 15 of 2009 in Tehran city came out and protested. If we take a look and compare the 3 million with the 1979 revolution, when population, of course, was smaller in Tehran, but it took about 1 year in Tehran to have a 1 million population coming and joining the protests. 1 million took about 1 year to join the struggles against the Shah. In 2009, in 2 days, basically, 3 million showed up, and this was huge. And throughout the country, other major cities, hundreds of thousands of people everywhere came and joined in the next 2-3 days. And so there were millions of people who were protesting. The problem was that medium-sized and smaller cities did not join in.
And in our last segment, we'll find out if this convergence can happen. Stay with us. It's Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We're back in our final national segment. Dartmouth professor Misagh Parsa. He's been parsing opaque Iran. So let me ask you this: the students, the working class, the small business, the merchant class, as you said it. Is there a chance they can come together to make this happen? Do we want a revolution, or is it in our interest in the U.S. that it be a failed state?
Well, it's I think in the interest of Iranians, but also in the interest of the United States and the whole world to promote democracy in Iran. And a failed state is going to be a source of all kinds of problems for domestic and the population, but also other people in the world. So failed state is not something. Some of the problems with terrorism, that's where they come from. But can I finish the segment that we just finished, talking about how the Green Movement failed?
Okay.
So what happened was that because the medium-sized and smaller cities did not join, the problem for the Islamic Republic was that there were divisions in the Revolutionary Guard, which is a huge problem. And not all the Revolutionary Guard were in favor of repressing the Green Movement and the opposition at that time. And so the government had to resort to just security forces, but also to their paramilitary, with called Basij over there, paramilitary forces. What happened, they didn't have enough paramilitary in Tehran, and the security forces were not able to repress the Green Movement. That's why it lasted for about 20 months, which is huge. And so because the smaller and medium-sized didn't join, they were able to bring the Basij, the paramilitary forces, to Tehran and larger cities and repress the opposition.
Can I ask you, you mentioned the Revolutionary Guard. What is the balance of power between the clerics, the theocratic regime, and the Revolutionary Guard?
Well, right now, the clergy has the upper hand, of course. The clergy runs everything. They call all the shots. And Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the supreme leader, he's the one. But they have become very much dependent on the Revolutionary Guard, particularly after the Khatami's administration. So they give the Revolutionary Guards a lot of economic assets and resources. They win 70-80% of all the contracts with the government. So it has controls about 25% of the GDP, has become a major participant in the economic activities of the country. So they control the guns, but they also control a great deal of the gold in the country, including the oil sector, gas, you name it, they're everywhere. So the Islamic regime needs the Revolutionary Guard. Without the Revolutionary Guard and the support of at least the upper echelon of the Revolutionary Guard, they cannot. But the Revolutionary Guard is not calling the shots. It's the clergy that's doing it. It's possible in the future they may come into conflict and the arrangement might change, but right now it's the clergy that has the control.
All right, now let me ask you this. Your theory is reform or revolution. You've ruled out reform. Do you believe there, you've gone through the history of failed attempts at democracy in Iran. Why do you feel that a revolution is inevitable and that it will be successful, or don't you?
Well, given the structure they have created, it's an exclusive state. And exclusive state doesn't allow anybody. Look at all the presidents and prime ministers they have had. Anybody who came to power was finally eliminated, disgraced. Prime Minister Bazargan during the hostage crisis. President Bani Sadr after him. And President Khatami, two-time president, he's disgraced. You can't publish his picture, print his picture, or publish his statements in the media. He can't travel abroad. The latest one, you can just keep going. The list is very long. The latest one is Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. He was president for 8 years. Ayatollah Khamenei defended him. He said he won, and his ideas are closer to my own, and so he's the president and all that, and his government is very clean. Now, in the recent election, he was told by Ayatollah Khamenei not to participate. He said, "You are polarizing, and don't participate in this election." He said, "Okay, he won't." But then he went went forward and he registered to participate. Of course, then he was immediately disqualified and eliminated by the Guardian Council. And now you think about it. Why is it Ahmadinejad was told by the Supreme Leader not to register and not participate? Now, when you look at it, his statements and interviews he has given, Mr. Ahmadinejad likes to be in the opposition because he realizes that the vast majority of the Iranian people are in the opposition against the Islamic Republic. So he now wants to become popular among the opposition. That was the secret of him trying to participate and then being discredited. Now he can claim that I'm against the system, and he keeps making statements about the problems of the Islamic Republic. So the system is theocratic. Iranians had at least cultural freedom, social and cultural freedom. If a woman doesn't want to wear the scarf, the hijab, she was free before the revolution. If a person wants to drink alcohol, they were free. You want to go to a bar, discotheque, and dance and listen to whatever music you want to listen and whatever channel you want to listen to and station. And so they had cultural freedom and social freedoms. And what happened with the Islamic Revolution, Islamic Republic, they lost that promise of political freedom. They didn't gain the political freedom they were promised. They lost their economic standing compared to what they had in 1978, 79, or 1976. They are poorer now than ever before during the monarchy. And so the problem is that they were promised all the freedoms. The problem, they lost the social freedoms they had. So basically they have lost in every area of social life. And that's why I'm thinking that the conflict between the population and the Islamic regime is irreconcilable. To survive, the Islamic regime has resorted to what I call endless repression. When I mentioned the number of executions between 1981 to 1985, or then 1988, the Islamic regime in the first 4 years executed several times more people than the Shah killed during the revolutionary struggle. And that doesn't include the executions of pro-monarchists that I'm not including, but also religious minorities such as Baha'is. They are not included because they are prisoners of conscience and they are executed because of their belief system. So those are not included. So the Islamic regime has resorted to endless repression. Without endless repression, they are not going to survive. They are not going to stay in power because the vast majority of the population now have moved away from the Islamic regime. So every day we have stories that the Islamists or the clergy, in many cases, just happened 3 days ago near the city of Neyshabur. The clergy went and told these young people to behave themselves and do something. It's not clear what they were doing, so he told them to behave. And the fellow started attacking the cleric, and a couple of cars came by and said, "What's going on?" And they were told that, this clergy told him was the Friday prayer leader of the town. So they came out, and there were several people beat up this clergy, and he ended up in the hospital. This just came out. Last week there was one in Shahr-e near Tehran, part of Tehran, suburb of Tehran, and another clergy was beaten up. And it happens all the time. The conflict is more serious than being just initiating small changes and reforming a piece of the system.
And that's been a fascinating, enlightening hour. In fact, it shows me how little we understand what's going on inside Iran and that the other big insight is that I've gained is that the internal threat is bigger than the external threat for Iran. Misagh's book is Democracy in Iran, Why It Failed, How It Might Succeed. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. I want to thank Misagh Parsa at Dartmouth. Thanks to our national audience for listening. See you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We're back with Misagh Parsa. He's the author of Democracy in Iran, Why It Failed and How It Might Succeed. Let me ask you one question.
Yeah.
How long do you think, what's the time frame for when the thing could fall? Is there any ended?
I didn't have time because there is so much to talk about.
Uh-huh.
In 2009, they came close because the merchants were also opposing, and they had occasional protests. They were opposing Ahmadinejad and the rises he was trying to raise their taxes. And so the two conflicts, unfortunately, didn't come together. So the Bazaris were protesting before and then afterwards, and the Green Movement came in the middle. They didn't connect.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
If there's this degree of internal conflict going on, what should the U.S. be doing to foment that?
You know, that's not very easy, because if you look at the entire history of Iran in the 20th century, Iranians have revolted only during periods when political repression declined. That's one of the greatest indicators of predicting Iran's population collective action and protests. So you have early 1950s. Well, you have 1941 that the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union invaded Iran, got rid of the dictator and the Reza Shah, the old king, and brought democracy to Iran. And there was a lot of political activities going on all the way till 1953 when Misagh was overthrown. So there was a lot of protests happening. Then early 1960s, President Kennedy pressed Iran for a little bit liberalizing, and so the Shah liberalized a little bit, and there were protests again. And then 1977-79, when President Carter came and talked about human rights, and protests emerged. And then you get 1999 when Khatami took office, and there was a little bit of liberalization, student protests. And then 2003, again student protests in response to some liberalization. And then 2009 is the elections and so on. So what the United States need to do is to ensure that Iran is a little bit more liberal for Iranians to protest. As long as you have this endless repression going on, the government instigates conflict against the United States and Israel, and then represses the population. As long as you have political repression going on, the people are not going to come out because they're afraid. And if, God forbid, they say, if there's a conflict now, last night the White House made the statement about releasing the Americans that are held in Iranian prison, or Iranian Americans and Chinese Americans.
So in a sense, it may be counter our interest to try to foment stuff and become the bad guy.
Yes, if the regime is collapsing, the United States could do that. But
Okay.
Before that, you need to promote greater political freedom for them to be able to come out and protest.
Let me ask you this now.
Yeah.
What's the threat that they would use nuclear weapons?
Iran would use nuclear weapons?
Yes.
Oh, no, that's really not serious.
So you don't think there's a threat of that?
No. Yeah, it's extremely unlikely they would do anything. First of all, to have it, and then how do you carry it and how do you do it? Israel is much more powerful than Iran. Iran knows if they would be getting it just for threat, maybe, and that's what they were going to do. But using it, that's unthinkable.
Okay, so they're not crazy like the guy in North Korea.
No, they are interested in wealth and power. They are clerics, and right now there is we didn't get to talk about it. There is a clerical organization called Awqaf. It means like donations or endowments. They have seized now, every day they are seizing people's property and land. Jeez. They have seized about 1/3 of the land of the country, according to their own claim.
Jeez.
And a parliament deputy stated 4 years ago that they have seized so much land in the country that they could declare a new country for themselves.
One of the things you talk about, too, is that this is a theocratic state, but the folks up to 75 to 90% aren't even doing daily prayer, for instance. They're not following the religious dictates.
86% of the
86.
youth and students do not say the daily prayer, and Ayatollah Khamenei and Khomeini, both of them, emphasized every day. They're doing it now. And then 75% of the entire adult population doesn't say the obligatory daily prayer. And when we go to the mosques, only about 5% of the close to 60,000 mosques are operating all year round, and they're basically empty, most of them. Actually, about 50% of the mosques do not even have a Friday prayer leaders and clerics. And so Iran's situation is very dire, and the problem for Islam is the greatest problem. So if atheists would try to tell people there is no God and don't believe in Islam, they would never succeed. The Islamic Republic succeeded in making the Iranian people atheists and converting to Christianity, and in some cases to Baha'is and other religions. And it's just stunning thing that has happened after the revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini every day said, the Shah has undermined Islam and we need to bring Islam back. So the Islamic Republic from his point of view, came back in order to bring Islam back. And so the outcome has been the opposite. Islam has lost the support of much of the population, and that's one of the saddest things for the Islamic Republic, that their own people know. Now, about a year ago, Ayatollah Rafsanjani's daughter, her name is Faize Rafsanjani. Rafsanjani was one of the founders of the Islamic Republic, probably the second most powerful man after Khomeini for years. And he's now dead. But last year, I think it was last year or the year before, I think it was last year, she said it publicly that she said Islam is a perfect religion, but she doesn't support a religious state because a religious state has undermined Islam. What they have done is that they have made people to abandon Islam. That's what she said, and I have her quote. Unfortunately, it was too late to get it in the book, but hopefully in the next one. And so Ayatollah Khamenei's own brother, which is in the book, first chapter, Hadi Khamenei, he said that we don't really want a state religion. We can have Islamic regime, but the clergy shouldn't necessarily rule. And the more the clergy rules, all their mistakes are interpreted as being mistakes of Islam or problem with Islam, and people have been moving away from Islam. There are some clerics in Iran who ended up deciding not to live in Iran and went to Najaf in Iraq or went elsewhere. And so you walk in the street, if you have your clerical robe, people mock you, people insult you. And this is their statement, not mine, that they insult you and they ridicule you, and sometimes they beat you up. It's in the book, in the first chapter, two girls in this small city called Shahmirzad in northern Iran. Two girls are walking, and the Friday prayer leader tells them, cover your hair. And one of the girls responded, shut your eyes. And then he got angry and he started bad-mouthing. The two teenage girls started beating him up. He ended up in the hospital.
Wow.
This is the extent of rebellion among the...
Just terrible. We're talking with Professor Misagh Parsa. This is the commercial-free YouTube version of our interview that extends the show into overtime, as we call it, and also available at WYBC at Yale Radio, commercial-free. I want to ask you a couple other questions. Did we essentially turn Iraq over to Iran when we pulled out?
Well, right now, Iran has been becoming increasingly more powerful. Iran has a lot more money than Iraq, particularly after the revolution in Iran. Iran's oil revenues increased, but also the Iraqi regime. So economically, they're greatly influenced by the Iranian government. So a lot of their economic resources are paid for by Iran. But a lot of also commodities are exported from Iran into Iraq. There's a lot of it. It's just not one or two. But also construction. A lot of their activities are handled by Iranian companies, a lot of them by the Revolutionary Guard and so forth. The government, the Iraqi government, is also very much dependent on Iran in part because there's a rebellion going on, and the other side is Sunni, and so the Shiite Iran, which has mobilized militias in Iraq, even during the Saddam Hussein's rule, they have become very dependent on the Islamic regime. So there is the danger calling that Iraq has become very much under the influence. Yes, under the influence. So far, that's what it looks like, that Iran is influencing a great deal of what happens in Iraq. Not completely, but a great deal of the political processes are influenced by Iran.
Is that bad for us, or the fact that they're fighting Sunni forces a good thing?
Well, the problem...
ISIS, I mean,
is,
yes.
The way I view it is bad for the Iraqis, because a lot of the Sunnis definitely want to be independent. And Iraq needs to stand on its own feet. The more Iran intervenes, the more it promotes Shiite interests. And although the Shiites are the majority, that's their choice, the problem is that Iraq itself, and from our own point of view, needs to promote democracy rather than sectarian interests. And the more they promote sectarian interests, the greater the likelihood that the conflicts with the Sunnis will continue. But also, there's the problem that the danger that the Kurds might break away and declare independence and move away from Iraq.
Those are great points. How about I'm going to turn to Syria for a sec. Is it good for us that they're taking on ISIS to the extent they can?
So, from the United States point of view,
yes.
ISIS is a bigger problem. But the issue is that ISIS itself is an inspiration from the Islamic regime in Iran. Before the 1979 revolution, when the Iranian revolution became an Islamic revolution, a lot of people call it, it took a theocratic form, they didn't exist. So there was small pockets here and there thought about, there's Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt, and there are other very small groups, but it wasn't really. But once they weren't powerful. Once the 1979 revolution in Iran comes, they are inspired by the revolution. But also when the conflicts in Egypt and Syria, these countries started experiencing, Tunisia started experiencing conflict, Ayatollah Khamenei said that, yes, the Islamic revolution is spreading. This is anti-American and it's in favor of Islamic revolution. Mm-hmm. But then soon it became clear that they weren't exactly in favor of the Islamic revolution that Iran was promoting, but they had their own interests, their own ideas. And so Ayatollah Khamenei had to intervene both in Syria and in Iraq, fighting that Islamic movement that they had themselves instigated, and so they are engaged in fighting. So in my view, the problem of the Islamic State and the Sunnis should not be handled through violence and wars. Although they instigated it, that was not the solution, because the Sunnis are not going to go away. The problem should have been power sharing. The problem should have been democracy, rather than fighting wars and dropping bombs. And yesterday, the White House decided that the CIA will no longer contribute resources to the pro-American forces in Syria. So it's not clear what is going to happen in fight for democracy in Syria. Assad has not been in favor of democracy, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is not in favor of promoting democracy in Syria or in Iraq. They are in favor of their own interests, and their interest is not democracy. And so it's very unfortunate that it came to war and the United States got involved. After Saddam Hussein was overthrown, democracy should have been promoted and sectarian conflicts avoided, and unfortunately it didn't work out. And then finally, with it spread to Syria, the same thing is going on, just killing and shooting, and in my view, there should have been more diplomacy handling those problems, rather than favoring one Islamic faction against another Islamic faction. That should have never been the framework of anybody's work.
Very interesting. Let's finish up with what do you see as the best and worst case scenarios in Iran?
The best scenario from the point of view of those who want to promote democracy is for the Islamic regime to quickly abandon everything they imposed after the revolution. So the theocratic structures, the privileges given to the clergy should be abandoned. Because democracy means empowering the people vis-a-vis the state. The state is controlled by the clergy, and the clergy is given immense powers and privileges. All of those should be dismantled. Political power should be restored to the people, democratic rights. And right now, people, the only right they have to go drop a ballot. And they have all the obligations they have to do in terms of drinking, living, eating, walking in the streets, music, dealing with your family, dealing with the political issues, economics. Everything is controlled. People have obligations, but no rights, or very little rights. And so the regime claims that we want to take the people to paradise. But Iranians have refused to be coerced into paradise. And that's what. Men and women live together without getting married. This is called, they call it white marriage. And this is the extent of the Islamic regime. The people are in rebellion in every respect, and the Islamic regime has to abandon all of this. Power has to be restored to the people. Power has to be taken away from the clergy. Economic resources has to be given to the people, and all these resources given to the Revolutionary Guard has to be privatized. Right now, there has been about 17% of the assets of the government have been privatized. But the actual reality is that only less than 5% has been privatized. Everything else, the Revolutionary Guard keeps buying all these assets. When a guard ends up becoming both controlling the guns and the gold, that becomes very difficult to control them. That's exactly what Suharto did. The military, and also in Egypt, under from Nasser all the way to President Mubarak, the military ended up controlling a lot of resources and economic assets. When you do that, democracy becomes very difficult because the military ends up attending autonomy vis-a-vis the civilian population. You cannot control them. The economic resources should be controlled by the civilian population. So all of these would be some of the best things. The clergy has to give up the foundations, give it to the people or to the government, and so these things have to change. Now, the worst scenario would be that if they accepted all of these things, would be great. The worst one would be, of course, to overthrow the clergy by the Revolutionary Guard and bring in a military government. To me, that's no alternative because they already have that. They're already doing it. But produce another massacre and kill a whole bunch of thousands of people and then avoid going through the democratic process and having democracy.
We've been talking with Dartmouth Professor Misagh Parsa in what's been a brilliant and passionate analysis. The book is Democracy in Iran, Why It Failed, How It Might Succeed. Our next show, we've got Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. David Satter joins us. He's an expert on Russia, and he's going to talk about Russia's road to terror and dictatorship under Yeltsin and Putin. Probably a natural follow-on to this show. Misagh, thanks for your time. Thanks to the folks, at Dartmouth Broadcasting, Dartmouth Radio. Thanks to our national audience. And we'll see everybody again, as we said, next Sunday, Business Talk with Jim Campbell.